Sir, you match the description of a reported shoplifter. I need to talk to you.
I'm just shopping. I can show you my ID.
Don't make this difficult.
I'm a Navy SEAL officer. I'm not here to cause trouble.
Yeah, sure. Look, you're coming with me. Don't argue.
I haven't done anything wrong.
Let's go, now.
Officer Eric Mallory responded to a grocery store call about a suspicious, muscular black man named Donovan Pierce and immediately treated him like a criminal for the crime of carefully selecting groceries for his mother. Without cause, he grabbed him and slammed him into store shelving while Pierce, a man with 12 years of Navy SEAL training, chose to absorb every second of the assault without defending himself because he understood exactly how a black man fighting back against a white officer would end. What Mallory didn't know was that Donovan Pierce was an active-duty Navy SEAL with 12 years of special operations experience who had the physical capability to end the confrontation in under 3 seconds, but chose instead to endure the assault because he trusted the truth. That security camera footage from 3 different angles would destroy every single word of Mallory's false report, and that his assumption that a large, muscular black man browsing a grocery store must be dangerous would cost him his badge, his freedom, and 14 years in prison. Before we go further, what city or country are you watching from? Drop it in the comments. We love seeing where you're tuning in from. If you believe grocery shopping while black shouldn't get you assaulted by a cop, then like this video and subscribe. Donovan Pierce pulled into the parking lot of Riverside Grocery at 11:30 on a Saturday morning with a list on his phone and nowhere urgent to be. At 34 years old, Pierce had spent the last 12 years as a Navy SEAL, completing deployments in some of the most dangerous environments on Earth, operating under conditions that would break most people in hours. He was currently on 2 weeks of leave after returning from an overseas assignment that he couldn't discuss with anyone outside his unit, and the first thing his mother had asked when he called to say he was coming home was whether he would make it in time for Sunday dinner. He'd said yes without hesitation. Pierce was a big man, 6'2", 220 pounds of lean muscle built through 12 years of the most demanding physical training the military offered. He wore gray sweatpants, a plain white t-shirt, and clean white sneakers. He looked relaxed and unhurried, which was exactly how he felt. After months of operational tension, a Saturday morning grocery run for his mother's Sunday dinner was the kind of normal that felt genuinely good. He grabbed a basket near the entrance and pulled up his mother's list on his phone. She'd sent it the night before with notes attached to each item, specific brands she preferred, exact quantities, reminders about which aisle certain things were usually on. Pierce smiled reading it. His mother had sent detailed grocery lists since he was a teenager and the format had never changed. He tucked his phone into his sweatpants pocket and started working through the store systematically, the same way he approached everything, methodically, carefully, without rushing. Pierce moved through the produce section first, taking his time selecting the right tomatoes, checking the freshness of the herbs his mother needed, comparing 2 bunches of collard greens before choosing the better one. He wasn't in a hurry. He had the whole morning and he wanted to get it right. He moved to the next aisle, comparing pasta brands, reading labels, putting one back and choosing another. He was a man who paid attention to details. 12 years of special operations had made that a permanent personality trait. Near the back of the store, a young white female store employee named Cassie watched Pierce from behind the customer service desk. Cassie had been watching him since he walked in, her eyes tracking the large, muscular black man as he moved through the aisles. She watched him take his time in produce. She watched him compare items in the pasta aisle. She watched him read labels carefully and put things back. To any reasonable observer, this was a man doing his grocery shopping thoughtfully. To Cassie, something about it made her deeply uncomfortable, and the discomfort had nothing to do with anything Pierce had actually done. Pierce hadn't spoken to anyone inappropriately. He hadn't touched anything he wasn't supposed to touch. He hadn't raised his voice or acted aggressively or given anyone any reason to be concerned. He was simply a large black man taking his time in a grocery store, and Cassie had decided that was suspicious enough to act on. She picked up the store phone and called the local police non-emergency line. "Hi, I'm calling from Riverside Grocery on Madison Street. There's a suspicious man in the store. He's a black male, very large and muscular, been in here for a while, and he's just walking around looking at things. He's making me uncomfortable, and I think you should send someone." The dispatcher asked if the man had done anything threatening or illegal. Cassie said no, but repeated that he was making her uncomfortable, and she thought it was suspicious that he'd been in the store so long without buying anything yet. The dispatcher logged the call and sent the nearest available officer. What Cassie didn't know was that there were 8 security cameras mounted throughout Riverside Grocery covering every angle of the floor, the entrance, the service desk, and the parking lot. Every second of her watching Pierce was recorded. Every second of her picking up the phone was recorded. and every word of what was about to happen in the next 15 minutes would be captured from 3 separate camera angles, in perfect, high-definition clarity. Officer Eric Mallory arrived at Riverside Grocery at 11:52 in the morning in full uniform, parking his patrol car in the fire lane directly in front of the entrance. Mallory was 47 years old, white, and had been a police officer for 20 years. He had the kind of confidence that comes not from competence, but from 2 decades of never being seriously held accountable for anything. He walked into the store with the bearing of someone who had already decided what they were going to find before they found it. He approached Cassie at the service desk first. She pointed toward the back of the store where Pierce was now in the cereal aisle, reading the back of a box, comparing it to another one he was holding. Mallory looked at Pierce from across the store, a large, muscular black man in casual clothes, and his jaw set with the certainty of a man whose racism had been allowed to function unchecked for so long that he'd stopped recognizing it as racism. He called it instinct. He called it experience. He called it reading a situation. He walked toward Pierce with his thumbs hooked in his belt, his body language already broadcasting authority and hostility in equal measure. Pierce heard the footsteps and looked up from the cereal boxes as Mallory stopped 3 feet away. "What are you doing in here?" Mallory asked, his tone carrying the particular arrogance of someone who believes the question is completely reasonable. Pierce looked at the basket in his hand, then at the cereal boxes he was holding, then back at Mallory with an expression of genuine confusion. "I'm grocery shopping." "Someone called and said you've been in here a while just walking around," Mallory said. "I'm shopping for my mother," Pierce said calmly. "I'm trying to get everything on her list. Is there a problem?" Mallory looked him up and down. "You got any ID on you?" Pierce felt the familiar cold recognition settle in his chest, the recognition that this had nothing to do with what he was doing and everything to do with what he looked like. He'd experienced it before. Every black man his size experienced it regularly. But he kept his voice even. "I do. It's in my car. I didn't bring my wallet in for a grocery run." Mallory's eyes narrowed. "Empty your pockets." Pierce looked at him steadily. "I haven't done anything wrong. I'm shopping. I have a right to be in this store." "I'm not asking," Mallory said. Pierce set the cereal boxes down carefully on the shelf beside him and reached into his sweatpants pockets, pulling them inside out to show they contained only his phone and his keys. "There's nothing there," Pierce said. "I'm shopping for groceries." Mallory's demeanor shifted from hostile to aggressive without any intermediate step. "You need to come with me," he said, reaching out and grabbing Pierce's arm. Pierce felt Mallory's hand close around his forearm, and in a fraction of a second his SEAL training processed the physical situation with complete clarity. Mallory was 47 years old, average build, no tactical awareness, hand position poor. Pierce could have removed that grip and ended the physical confrontation in under 3 seconds without causing serious injury. He knew exactly how to do it. His body knew how to do it the way other people's bodies knew how to breathe. He chose not to. Instead, Pierce stood perfectly still and said clearly and calmly, "I'm not resisting. I have done nothing wrong. Please let go of my arm." Mallory didn't let go. He yanked Pierce's arm sideways and shoved him hard toward the shelving unit on the left side of the aisle. Pierce hit the shelving with his shoulder and back, sending boxes of cereal tumbling to the floor. A woman shopping at the end of the aisle gasped and pulled her cart back. A man 2 aisles over heard the crash and looked around the corner. "Stop resisting!" Mallory shouted, though Pierce had not moved a single muscle to resist anything. Pierce braced against the shelving and stayed on his feet, his hands visible, his body deliberately passive. "I'm not resisting," he said again, his voice still controlled despite the pain in his shoulder from being thrown into metal shelving. "I have done nothing wrong." Mallory grabbed both of the Pierce's arms and wrenched them behind his back with force that was completely disproportionate to a man who was standing still and cooperating. The handcuffs went on tight, too tight, and Mallory began walking Pierce toward the front of the store while cereal boxes lay scattered on the floor around them. Other shoppers watched in stunned silence. A teenage boy near the checkout pulled out his phone and started recording. An older woman shook her head slowly. The store manager, who had come out of his office when he heard the crash, watched from near the service desk with an expression of visible discomfort, his eyes moving between Pierce and Mallory and the scattered groceries on the floor. Cassie stood behind the service desk and watched the man she'd called police on being walked out in handcuffs, and felt the flush of something she told herself was relief, but was actually the specific discomfort of a person who has just watched the consequences of their own bias play out in front of them in a way that can't be easily rationalized. Outside, Mallory's backup arrived, Officer James Tate, younger, quieter, who took one look at Pierce standing calmly against the patrol car, and then at Mallory's aggressive posture and felt the immediate discomfort of a man who suspects he's arrived at a situation that isn't what it was called in a... After 20 minutes during which Pierce stated his name, said repeatedly that his ID was in his car and could be verified, and maintained calm consistency throughout, Mallory issued him a disorderly conduct citation and removed the handcuffs. No arrest. Not enough to justify one even by Mallory's own reasoning. Just a citation and a warning to leave the premises. Pierce took the citation, looked at it for a moment, then looked at Mallory with an expression that was completely unreadable. He walked to his car, sat in the driver's seat, and pulled out his phone. He didn't call a lawyer. He didn't call a family member. He scrolled to a contact labeled Commander Walsh and pressed call. When Walsh answered, Pierce said 7 words in the flat, precise tone of a man trained to report under pressure. "Sir, I have an incident to report." Inside the grocery store, 3 security cameras sat in their ceiling mounts, their hard drives full of everything that had just happened, waiting for someone to ask the right questions. Commander David Walsh listened to Donovan Pierce describe the incident from start to finish without interrupting once. Pierce spoke the way he always spoke when reporting, in sequence, without emotion, leaving nothing out and adding nothing extra. When Pierce finished, Walsh was quiet for exactly 3 seconds before he spoke. "Don't say another word to anyone about this," Walsh said. "Not to the officer, not to the store, not to anyone. I'm handling it from right now." Walsh hung up and immediately made 2 calls. The first was to Riverside Grocery, where he spoke to the store manager and informed him that the incident involving the customer just removed from his store had legal implications that required all security footage from that morning to be locked, preserved, and made available to investigators immediately. The manager, who had already been uncomfortable about what he'd witnessed, agreed without argument and locked the footage within the hour. The second call Walsh made was to the police department's Internal Affairs Division, where he identified himself, explained that one of his active-duty Navy SEALs had just been physically assaulted by Officer Eric Mallory in a grocery store while shopping for groceries, and that a false incident report was likely being filed at that exact moment. The Internal Affairs officer on the other end of the line went very quiet and asked Walsh to hold while he pulled up Mallory's service record. While Walsh was making those calls, Mallory was back at the station writing his incident report with the relaxed confidence of a man who had done this many times before and had never faced serious consequences for it. His report described Pierce as aggressive and threatening, stated that Pierce had refused to comply with lawful orders, claimed that Pierce had made a physical movement that put Mallory in fear for his safety, and described the use of force as necessary and proportionate. Every word was either an exaggeration or a complete fabrication, and Mallory wrote it with the ease of someone who considered the report a formality rather than a legal document. Internal Affairs pulled the grocery store footage the following morning, and 3 investigators watched it together in a review room without speaking. The footage from the first camera showed Pierce moving through the store calmly and methodically for 19 minutes before Mallory arrived, selecting items carefully, reading labels, putting things back, doing exactly what a man shopping for his mother's Sunday dinner does. The footage from the second camera showed Mallory entering the store, speaking briefly to the staff member at the service desk, and then walking toward Pierce with body language that communicated aggression before he had exchanged a single word with the man. The footage from the third camera, positioned directly above the cereal aisle, showed everything that happened next. In perfect overhead clarity, Mallory grabbing Pierce without justification, Pierce standing completely still, Mallory slamming Pierce into the shelving, Pierce bracing but not retaliating, Mallory wrenching his arms behind his back while Pierce remained physically passive throughout. Then the investigators read Mallory's incident report and read it again. The report described a completely different encounter to the one shown on 3 separate cameras. There was no moment in any footage where Pierce was aggressive. There was no physical movement that could reasonably be interpreted as threatening. There was no resistance of any kind at any point. The report was not an exaggerated account of a real event. It was a fabrication written by a man who assumed no evidence existed. Mallory was called into the station the next morning and told to bring his union representative. He arrived expecting a routine conversation about paperwork. Instead, he was walked into a review room where 2 internal affairs investigators and his captain were waiting. Nobody said anything when he sat down. One investigator reached forward and pressed play on a laptop screen positioned in front of Mallory. Mallory watched himself walk into Riverside Grocery. He watched himself approach Pierce. He watched himself grab Pierce and slam him into the shelving while Pierce stood completely still. He watched himself handcuff a man who had not moved a single muscle in resistance. The footage played for 4 minutes and 12 seconds. And nobody in the room said a word until it ended. His captain looked at him across the table. "Would you like to explain the difference between what we just watched and what you wrote in your report?" Mallory's union representative put a hand on his arm before he could speak, but the damage was already permanent because there was no explanation that 3 camera angles would allow. While Mallory sat in that review room running out of answers, the grocery store footage had already leaked to a local news station through a source inside the department who had seen it and couldn't stay quiet. By the time Mallory left the station that afternoon suspended without pay, the footage was on television. By the time he got home, it was on social media. By midnight, it had 8 million views. By the following morning, it had 30 million, and the name Donovan Pierce was trending nationally. That same morning, the Internal Affairs investigators reviewed the grocery store's full camera system, including the footage of the service desk. They watched Cassie make the call to police, watched her eyes tracking Pierce through the store for several minutes before she picked up the phone, watched her point Mallory toward Pierce when he arrived. They watched a woman call police on a black man for carefully selecting groceries and looking too muscular while doing it. The store manager was shown the footage that afternoon. He watched his employee call police on a customer who had done absolutely nothing wrong. He called Cassie into his office the same day and terminated her employment effective immediately, telling her that what she had done was not only wrong, but had exposed the store to serious legal liability, and had contributed directly to an innocent man being assaulted on his premises. Cassie tried to argue that she had genuinely felt uncomfortable. The manager told her that feeling uncomfortable because a black man was large and taking his time shopping was not a reason to call police, and that her discomfort did not justify what followed. She collected her belongings and left the building knowing that her face and her phone call were now part of footage that 30 million people had seen. Mallory's suspension became the least of his problems when the criminal charges arrived 3 days later. Assault, filing a false police report, and civil rights violations under color of law. Pierce filed a federal civil rights lawsuit the same week, and when Pierce's attorney requested Mallory's full personnel file as part of the discovery process, what came back made the assault in the grocery store look like the end of a very long story rather than a single, isolated incident. Mallory's personnel file arrived at Pierce's attorney's office in a sealed folder containing 20 years of documented complaints, internal reviews, disciplinary records, and supervisor sign-offs. The attorney opened it and spent 2 hours reading it cover to cover. When she finished, she sat back in her chair and said one thing to her paralegal. He should have been fired in 2011. 28 complaints had been filed against Eric Mallory during his 20-year career. 23 of them came from black or Hispanic residents. 16 were excessive force complaints. 11 were wrongful detention complaints. In 2011, a formal review board had recommended that Mallory be terminated after a particularly serious, excessive force complaint involving a black man who had been hospitalized following a traffic stop. The recommendation was overruled by a senior supervisor who described Mallory as a valuable officer with strong community instincts. That supervisor had since retired with full benefits. The black man who was hospitalized had received a small, quiet settlement and signed a non-disclosure agreement that had kept the incident buried for 13 years. There were 4 other incidents in Mallory's file where his written reports had been contradicted by witness accounts or partial footage. In each case, the department had sided with Mallory, dismissed the complaint, and closed the file. Nobody had ever sat all 28 complaints side by side and looked at the pattern they formed together. When Pierce's attorney did exactly that and presented the findings to the federal prosecutor handling the criminal case, the prosecutor described it as one of the clearest documented cases of institutional protection of a racially biased officer she had seen in 15 years of civil rights work. 7 people came forward within a week of the grocery store footage going viral. All of them had been stopped, detained, or physically handled by Mallory in situations where they had committed no offense. A black high school teacher stopped and aggressively questioned while jogging through a neighborhood Mallory apparently decided she didn't belong in. A black father detained for 40 minutes outside a school while waiting to pick up his daughter because Mallory decided he looked suspicious. A black college student slammed against a wall outside a convenience store because Mallory claimed he matched the description of someone reported in the area, though no such report existed in the department's system when investigators checked. Every one of them had filed complaints. Every complaint had been dismissed. Most of them had stopped believing anything would ever change, and then they watched 30 million people see what Mallory did to Donovan Pierce and decided to try one more time. Commander Walsh gave a public statement that was brief, precise, and devastating. He confirmed Pierce's identity and service record, stating that Pierce had completed 12 years of active duty Navy SEAL service, including multiple combat deployments, that Pierce had received commendations for valor in classified operations, and that Pierce possessed the physical training and combat capability to have ended his encounter with Mallory in seconds, but had instead chosen to absorb the assault without responding, because his discipline and his trust in the truth were stronger than his instinct to defend himself. Walsh paused at the end of his statement before adding one final line. The restraint Donovan Pierce showed in that grocery store required more strength than most people will ever be asked to demonstrate. He endured an assault he could have stopped because he understood that the truth was the more powerful weapon. He was right. Mallory's deposition was a slow and public collapse. His attorney had prepared him carefully, but there were questions that had no survivable answers. When the prosecutor asked him to identify the specific moment in the grocery store footage where Pierce made a threatening movement, Mallory couldn't point to one because it didn't exist. When asked why his report described Pierce as physically aggressive when 3 cameras showed Pierce standing still throughout the entire encounter, Mallory said he perceived aggression in Pierce's demeanor. When asked what specifically about Pierce's demeanor read as aggressive, Mallory said Pierce was large and intimidating, and didn't respond to his commands the way Mallory expected. The prosecutor let that answer breathe for a moment and then asked, "Is it possible that what you perceived as threatening was simply a large black man who didn't immediately submit to your authority?" Mallory's attorney objected. The objection was noted. The answer was already in the room. The criminal case went to trial 4 months after the assault. The prosecution kept its presentation simple because the evidence made simplicity the most powerful choice available. They played the grocery store footage in full. They read Mallory's incident report aloud. They played the footage again. They asked the jury to identify anything in the footage that matched anything in the report. Then they presented 28 complaints, 7 victim testimonies, and the 2011 recommendation for termination that had been overruled by a supervisor protecting a racist officer. Mallory took the stand in his own defense and spent 2 days trying to explain footage that didn't need explanation. Every answer he gave made the next question harder to survive. By the time his own attorney finished redirect examination, the defense case had not recovered a single point it had lost during cross-examination. Pierce attended every day of the trial in plain clothes, sitting in the gallery, watching the proceedings with the same steady composure he had shown in the cereal aisle of Riverside Grocery when Mallory's hands were on him. He didn't speak to the media outside the courthouse. He didn't perform emotion for cameras. He simply showed up every day, sat in the same seat, and let the evidence do what he had always believed it would do. The jury deliberated for 8 hours and returned guilty verdicts on all 3 counts: assault, filing a false police report, civil rights violations under color of law. Mallory sat at the defense table and stared at the middle distance as the verdicts were read. 20 years on the force, 28 complaints, 13 years since a review board had recommended his termination and been overruled. It had taken a Navy SEAL choosing not to fight back in a grocery store to end what should have ended in 2011. Pierce held his press conference outside the courthouse the afternoon the verdicts came in. He stood at the microphone in a clean white shirt with no jacket, no badge visible, just a man who had something to say and said it without decoration. "I chose not to defend myself that day because I knew the truth was already there," Pierce said. "It was on the cameras. It was in what actually happened. I just had to trust it and wait. What I didn't know was how many people had filed complaints against this officer before me and been ignored. What I didn't know was how many people had trusted that the truth would be enough and been let down. For them, I'm glad this time it wasn't." He stepped back from the microphone. Sentencing was in 3 weeks, and Officer Eric Mallory had run completely out of road. Judge Patricia Owens took 3 weeks reviewing Mallory's complete case file before sentencing, and when she walked into the courtroom on sentencing day, her expression showed a woman who had made her decision and was completely at peace with it. She reviewed the trial evidence one final time for the record, cited the 28 complaints, the 13-year-old termination recommendation that had been ignored, the 7 victims who testified, the false report filed with deliberate intent to cover up a racially motivated assault, and the extraordinary restraint shown by the victim who had the capability to defend himself, and chose the truth instead. Then Judge Owens looked directly at Mallory and spoke without notes because she didn't need them. "Officer Mallory, you spent 20 years hiding behind a badge and a department that protected you from the consequences of your own racism. You assaulted an innocent man in a grocery store because his size and his skin color triggered assumptions that your 20 years of experience should have eliminated but instead reinforced. When you went back to your station and wrote a report that described a completely different encounter to the one captured on 3 security cameras, you demonstrated that you knew exactly what you had done and chose deception over accountability. That choice tells me everything about your character and informs this sentence entirely." She sentenced Mallory to 14 years in state prison with possibility of parole after 10 years. At 47 years old, Mallory would be 57 at his earliest possible release. His pension was permanently revoked. His law enforcement certification was canceled for life. He was led from the courtroom in handcuffs, while his wife sat in the gallery and stared at her hands. The civil lawsuit Pierce filed against Mallory and the police department was settled 4 months after the criminal conviction for $2.4 million. The settlement was the largest excessive force payout in the city's history and included mandatory department-wide reforms. Every officer was required to complete 40 hours of racial bias training annually. All use of force incidents were required to be reviewed by an independent civilian board within 72 hours. Any discrepancy between an officer's written report and available footage triggered an automatic internal affairs investigation. Officers with 3 or more excessive force complaints within 5 years faced mandatory review and potential termination regardless of how previous complaints had been resolved. The supervisor who had overruled the 2011 termination recommendation was tracked down in retirement and formally censured. Though he could not be criminally charged, his name was entered into the public record of the case as someone whose decision to protect Mallory had directly enabled 13 additional years of racial profiling and the assault of a decorated Navy SEAL. His retirement benefits were placed under legal review. 4 other officers identified during the internal affairs review as having disproportionate complaint patterns similar to Mallory's were placed under immediate enhanced supervision. 2 resigned within a month rather than face ongoing scrutiny. 2 others were terminated after their own files were reviewed and found to contain patterns of conduct that had been repeatedly minimized and dismissed. Cassie, the store employee who had called police on Pierce for shopping carefully while black and muscular, had been terminated the same week the footage went viral. She could not find comparable retail employment in the city afterward because her face and her phone call were permanently attached to a story that 40 million people had seen. She gave one interview to a local newspaper 6 months after the incident in which she admitted she had acted on bias and expressed regret for what followed. The interview was widely read and mostly met with the opinion that regret expressed after consequences arrived was not the same as accountability. Officer James Tate, the backup officer who had arrived at the scene and been visibly uncomfortable with what he found, gave honest and complete testimony during Mallory's trial that corroborated the footage and Pierce's account without embellishment. He received a formal commendation for professional integrity and was promoted to senior officer. He later became involved in developing the department's new use of force training program, bringing the experience of that Saturday morning into classrooms full of officers who needed to understand what it looked like when a colleague crossed a line they should never have approached. Donovan Pierce returned to active duty 6 weeks after the trial. Commander Walsh noted in his service record that Pierce had demonstrated exceptional judgment and restraint during a civilian incident that would have justified a different response, and that the discipline Pierce showed reflected the values of the teams he served with and the country he served. Pierce used a significant portion of his civil settlement to establish a foundation supporting black veterans navigating civilian life, and the particular vulnerabilities that came with being large, black, and existing in spaces where those 2 facts alone were sometimes treated as a threat. The foundation provided legal support, mental health resources, and community advocacy for veterans who found that the transition from serving their country to living in it came with obstacles their service had done nothing to eliminate. In its first 2 years, the foundation helped 63 people, several of them men who had experienced encounters with police similar to Pierce's and had no resources or platform to fight back. The grocery store footage remained in circulation years after the trial. Used in police training academies, civil rights seminars, and university courses on institutional racism as a clear and simple example of what racial bias looks like when it operates without checks, what it produces when it goes unchallenged for 2 decades, and what it costs when the truth finally has enough cameras pointed at it to be undeniable. 5 years after the assault in the cereal aisle of Riverside Grocery, Donovan Pierce was still serving as an active duty Navy SEAL. Eric Mallory was in prison with 5 years remaining before parole eligibility, known among inmates and officers alike as the cop who assaulted a war hero over groceries and then lied about it in writing. The footage still had millions of views. The department had filed 3 consecutive years of improved use of force statistics. And somewhere in the city, 63 veterans were navigating civilian life with resources they hadn't had before a Saturday morning grocery run became the most important mission Donovan Pierce never planned to run. If this story showed you what happens when discipline, truth, and cameras align against 20 years of protected racism, share it with someone who needs to understand that accountability is possible, but only when good people refuse to stay silent. What changes would ensure that 28 complaints against one officer are never to be dismissed without consequence again? Drop your answers in the comments below, and tell us what reforms matter most to you. And if you believe the men and women who serve this country deserve basic dignity when they come home to shop for their mother's Sunday dinner, subscribe. Because we are bringing you more stories where the truth wins, where justice arrives exactly where it is needed, and where the people who spent decades hiding behind authority finally run out of places to hide.